Chapter 9. Small Crimes. Cold, eh, Colonel West? Yes, Your Highness. Winter is nearly upon us. There had been a kind of snow in the night, a cold, wet sleet that covered everything in icy moisture. Now, in the pale morning, the whole world seemed half frozen. The hooves of their horses crunched and slurped in the half-frozen mud. Water dripped sadly from the half-frozen trees. West was no exception. His breath smoked from his runny nose. The tips of his ears tingled unpleasantly, numb from the cold. Prince Ladislas hardly seemed to notice, but then he was swathed in an enormous coat, hat and mittens of shining black fur, no doubt several 100 marks worth of it. He grinned over. "The men seem good and fit, though, in spite of it all." West could scarcely believe his ears. The regiment of the King's Own that had been placed under Ladislas' command seemed happy enough, it was true. Their wide tents were pitched in orderly rows in the middle of the camp, cooking fires in front, horses tethered nearby in good order. The position of the levies, who made up a good 3/4 of their strength, was less happy. Many were shamefully ill-prepared. Men with no training or no weapons, some who were plainly too ill or too old for marching, let alone for battle. Some had little more than the clothes they stood up in, and those were in a woeful state. West had seen men huddled together under trees for warmth, nothing but half a blanket to keep the rain off. It was a disgrace. The King's Own are well provided for, but I'm concerned about the situation of some of the levies. Yes, said Ladislas, talking over him precisely as if he had not spoken. Good and fit, chomping at the bit. Must be the fire in their bellies keeps them warm, eh, West? Can't wait to get at the enemy. Damn shame we have to wait here, kicking our heels behind this damn river. West bit his lip. Prince Ladislas' incredible powers of self-deception were becoming more frustrating with every passing day. His Highness had fixed upon the idea of being a great and famous general, with a matchless force of fighting men under his command, of winning a famous victory and being celebrated as a hero back in Adua. Rather than exerting a single particle of effort to make it happen, however, he behaved as if it already had, utterly regardless of the truth. Nothing which was distasteful or displeasing or at odds with his cockeyed notions could be permitted to be noticed. Meanwhile, the dandies on his staff, without a month's military experience between them, congratulated him on his fine judgment, slapped each other on the back, and agreed with his every utterance, no matter how ludicrous. Never to want for anything, or work for anything, or show the tiniest grain of self-discipline in a whole life must give a man a strange outlook on the world, West supposed. And here was the proof, riding along beside him, smiling away as though the care of 10,000 men was a light responsibility. The Crown Prince and the real world, as Lord Marshal Burr had observed, were entire strangers to one another. Cold, Ladislas murmured. Not much like the deserts of Gurkle now, eh, Colonel West? No, Your Highness. But some things are the same, eh? I'm speaking of war, West. War in general. The same everywhere. The courage, the honor, the glory. You fought with Colonel Gloctor, didn't you? Yes, Your Highness, I did. I used to love to hear stories of that man's exploits. One of my heroes when I was young. Riding round the enemy, harassing his lines of communication, falling on the baggage train and what-not. The prince's riding crop rode around, harassed, and fell on imaginary baggage in the air before him. Capital! And I suppose you saw it all? Some of it, Your Highness, yes. He had seen a great deal of saddle soreness, sunburn, looting, drunkenness, and vainglorious showing off. Colonel Gloctor, I swear, we could do with some of that dash here, eh, West? Some of that vim, that vigor? Shame that he's dead. West looked up. He isn't dead, Your Highness. He isn't? He was captured by the Gurkish and then returned to the Union when the war ended. He joined the Inquisition." "The Inquisition?" The prince looked horrified. "Why on earth would a man give up the soldiering life for that?" West groped for words, but then thought better of it. "I cannot imagine, Your Highness." "Joined the Inquisition? Well, I never." They rode in silence for a moment. Gradually, the prince's smile returned. "But we were talking of the honor of war, were we not?" West grimaced. "We were, Your Highness." "First through the breach at Ulriok, weren't you? First through the breach, I heard. There's honor for you, eh? There's glory, isn't it? That must have been quite an experience, eh, Colonel? Quite an experience." Struggling through a mass of broken stones and timbers littered with twisted corpses, half blind with the smoke, half choking on the dust, shrieks and wails and the clashing of metal coming at him from all around, hardly able to breathe for fear. Men pressing in on all sides, groaning, shoving, stumbling, yelling, running with blood and sweat, black with grime and soot, half-seen faces twisted with pain and fury. Devils in hell. West remembered screaming, "Forward!" over and over until his throat was raw, even though he had no idea which way forward was. He remembered stabbing someone with his sword, friend or enemy he did not know then or now. He remembered falling and cutting his head on a rock, tearing his jacket on a broken timber. Moments, fragments, as if from a story he once heard someone else telling. West pulled his coat tighter round his chilly shoulders, wishing it was thicker. "Quite an experience, Your Highness." "Damn shame that bloody Bethod won't be coming this way." Prince Ladislas slashed petulantly at the air with his riding crop. "Little better than damn guard duty. Does Burr take me for a fool, eh, West? Does he?" West took a deep breath. "I couldn't possibly say, Your Highness." The prince's fickle mind had already moved off. "What about those pets of yours, those Northmen, the ones with the comical names? What's it called, that dirty fellow? Wolfman, is it?" "Dogman." "Dogman, that's it, capital." The prince chuckled to himself. "And that other one, biggest damn fellow I ever saw. Excellent. What are they up to?" "I sent them scouting north of the river, Your Highness." West rather wished he was with them. "The enemy are probably far away, but if they aren't, we need to know about it." "Of course we do. Excellent idea, so that we can prepare to attack." A timely withdrawal and a fast messenger to Marshal Burr was more what West had in mind, but there was no point in saying so. Ladislas' whole notion of war was of ordering a glorious charge, then retiring to bed. Strategy and retreat were not words in his vocabulary. "Yes," the prince was muttering to himself, eyes fixed intently on the trees beyond the river. "Prepare an attack and sweep them back across the border." The border was 100 leagues away. West seized his moment. "Your Highness, if I may, there is a great deal for me to do." It was no lie. The camp had been organized, or disorganized, without a thought for convenience or defense. An unruly maze of ramshackle canvas in a great clearing near the river, where the ground was too soft and had soon been turned into a morass of sticky mud by the supply carts. At first there had been no latrines, then they had been dug too shallow and much too close to the camp, not far from where the provisions were being stored. Provisions which, incidentally, had been badly packed, inadequately prepared, and were already close to spoiling, attracting every rat in Angland. If it had not been for the cold, West did not doubt that the camp would already have been riddled with disease. Prince Ladislas waved his hand. "Of course, a great deal to do. You can tell me more of your stories tomorrow, eh, West? About Colonel Gloctor and so forth. Damn shame he's dead," he shouted over his shoulder as he cantered off towards his enormous purple tent high up on the hill above the stink and confusion. West turned his mount with some relief and urged it down the slope into the camp. He passed men tottering through the half-frozen sludge, shivering, breath steaming, hands wrapped in dirty rags. He passed men sitting in sorry groups before their patched tents. No two dressed the same, as close to meagre fires as they dared, fiddling with cooking pots, playing miserable games of damp cards, drinking and staring into the cold air. The better-trained levies had gone with Polder and Croy to seek out the enemy. Ladislaw had been left with the rump, those too weak to march well, too poorly equipped to fight well, too broken even to do nothing with any conviction. Men who might never have left their homes in all their lives, forced to cross the sea to a land they knew nothing of, to fight an enemy they had no quarrel with, for reasons they did not understand. Some few of them might have felt some trace of patriotic fervor, some swell of manly pride when they left, but by now the hard marching, the bad food, and the cold weather had truly worn, starved, and frozen all enthusiasm out of them. Prince Ladislaw was scarcely the inspirational leader to put it back, had he even been making the slightest effort to do so. West looked down at those grim, tired, pinched faces as he rode past, and they stared back, beaten already. All they wanted was to go home, and West could hardly blame them. So did he. "Colonel West!" There was a big man grinning over at him, a man with a thick beard wearing the uniform of an officer in the King's Own. West realized with a start that it was Gjallarhorn. He slid down from his saddle and grabbed hold of the big man's hand in both of his. It was good to see him. A firm, honest, trustworthy presence. A reminder of a past life when West did not move among the great men of the world, and things were an awful lot simpler. "How are you, Gjallarhorn?" "All right, thank you, sir. Just taking a turn round the camp, waiting." The big man cupped his hands and blew into them, rubbed them together. "Trying to stay warm. That's what war is, in my experience. A great deal of waiting in unpleasant conditions. A great deal of waiting, with occasional moments of the most extreme terror." Gjallarhorn gave a dry grin. "Something to look forward to, then. How are things on the Prince's staff?" West shook his head. "A competition to see who can be most arrogant, ignorant, and wasteful. How about you? How's the camp life?" "We're not so badly off. It's some of these levies I feel sorry for. They're not fit to fight. I heard a couple of the older ones died last night from the cold." "It happens. Let's just hope they bury them deep and a good way from the rest of us." West could see that the big man thought him heartless, but there it was. Few of the casualties in Gurkle had died in battle. Accidents, illness, little wounds gone bad. You came to expect it. As badly equipped as some of the levies were, they would be burying men every day. "Nothing you need?" "There is one thing. My horse dropped a shoe in this mud, and I tried to find somewhere to fit a new one." Gjallarhorn spread his hands. "I could be wrong, but I don't think there's a smith in the whole camp." West stared at him. "Not one?" "I couldn't find any. There are forges, anvils, hammers, and all the rest, but no one to work them. I spoke to one of the quartermasters. He said General Polder refused to release any of his smiths, and so did General Croy, so, well," and Gjallarhorn shrugged his shoulders, "we don't have any." "No one thought to check?" "Oh." West felt the familiar headache tugging at the back of his eyes. Arrows need heads, blades need sharpening, armor and saddles and the carts that haul the supplies break and need to be repaired. An army with no smiths is little better than an army with no weapons. And here they were, out in the frozen country, miles from the nearest settlement. Unless... We passed a penal colony on the way. Gjallarhorn squinted as he tried to remember. "Yes, a foundry, I think. I saw smoke above the trees." They would have some skilled metal workers. The big man's eyebrows went up. "Some criminal metal workers. I'll take whatever we can get. Today your horse is short a shoe. Tomorrow we might have nothing to fight with. Get a dozen men together and a wagon. We'll leave at once. The prison loomed up out of the trees through the cold rain, a fence of great mossy logs tipped with bent and rusted spikes. A grim-looking place with a grim purpose. West swung from his saddle while Jallenhorm and his men reined up behind them, then squelched across the rutted track to the gate and hammered on the weathered wood with the pommel of his sword. It took a while, but eventually a small hatch snapped open. A pair of grey eyes frowned at him through the slot. Grey eyes above a black mask, a practical of the Inquisition. "My name is Colonel West." The eyes regarded him coldly. "So?" "I'm in the service of Crown Prince Ladislaw, and I need to speak to the commandant of this camp." "Why?" West frowned, doing his very best to look impressive with his hair plastered to his scalp and the rain dripping off his chin. "There is a war on, and I do not have time to bandy words with you. I need to speak to the commandant most urgently." The eyes narrowed. They looked at West for a while, and then at the dozen bedraggled soldiers behind him. "All right," said the practical. "You can come in, but only you. The rest will have to wait." The main street was a stretch of churned-up mud between leaning shacks, water trickling from the eaves, spattering into the dirt. There were 2 men and a woman in the road, wet through, struggling to move a cart laden with stones, up to the axles in mush. All 3 had heavy chains on their ankles. Ragged, bony, hollow faces, as empty of hope as they were empty of food. "Get that fucking cart shifted!" The practical growled at them, and they stooped back to their unenviable task. West struggled through the muck towards a stone building at the far end of the camp, trying to hop from one dry patch to another without success. Another dour practical was standing on the threshold, water running from a stained oilskin over his shoulders, hard eyes following West with a mixture of suspicion and indifference. He and his guide stepped past without a word and into the dim hall beyond, full of the noise of drumming rain. The practical knocked at an ill-fitting door. "Come in." A small spare room with grey walls, cold and smelling slightly of damp. A mean fire flickered in the grate. A sagging shelf was stacked with books. A portrait of the King of the Union stared regally down from one wall. A lean man in a black coat sat writing at a cheap desk. He looked at West for a while, then carefully put down his pen and rubbed at the bridge of his nose with an inky thumb and forefinger. "We have a visitor," grunted the practical. "So I see. I am Inquisitor Lawson, commandant of our little camp." West gave the bony hand the most perfunctory of squeezes. "Colonel West, I'm here with Prince Ladislaw's army. We're camped a dozen miles to the north." "Of course. How might I be of assistance to His Highness?" "We're desperately in need of skilled metal workers. You run a foundry here, correct?" "A mine, a foundry, and a smithy for the manufacture of farming tools, but I fail to see what—" "Excellent. I will take a dozen or so men back with me, the most skilled men you have available." The commandant frowned. "Out of the question. The prisoners here are guilty of the most serious crimes. They cannot be released without a signed order from the Archlector himself." "Then we have a problem, Inquisitor Lawson. I have 10,000 men with weapons that need sharpening, armor that needs mending, horses that need shoeing. We might be called into action at any moment. I cannot wait for orders from the Archlector or anyone else. I must leave with Smiths, and there it is." "But you must understand that I cannot allow—" "You fail to realize the gravity of the situation," barked West, his temper already fraying. "By all means, send a letter to the Archlector. I will send a man back to my camp for a company of soldiers. We can see who gets help first." The commandant thought about that for a while. "Very well," he said eventually. "Follow me." 2 dirty children stared at West from the porch of one of the shacks as he stepped out of the commandant's building back into the incessant drizzle. You have children here? We have whole families, if they are judged a danger to the state. Lawson glanced sideways at him. A shame, but holding the Union together has always required harsh measures. I gather from your silence that you disapprove. West watched one of the shabby children limping through the muck, doomed perhaps to spend their whole life in this place. I think it's a crime. The Commandant shrugged. Don't deceive yourself. Everyone is guilty of something, and even the innocent can be a threat. Perhaps it takes small crimes to prevent bigger ones, Colonel West, but it's up to bigger men than us to decide. I only make sure they work hard, don't prey upon each other, and don't escape. You only do your job, eh? A well-trodden way to avoid responsibility. Which of us is it who lives among them, out here in the middle of nowhere? Which of us is it who watches over them, dresses them, feeds them, cleans them, fights the endless, pointless war against their damn lice? Is it you who stops them beating and raping and killing each other? You're an officer in the King's Own, eh, Colonel? So you live in Adua, in fine quarters in the Agriont, among the rich and well-groomed? West frowned, and Lawson chuckled at him. Which of us has truly avoided the responsibility, as you put it? My conscience has never been cleaner. Haters, if you like, we're used to it. No one likes to shake hands with the man who empties the latrine pits either, but pits have to be emptied all the same, otherwise the world fills up with shit. You can have your dozen Smiths, but don't try to take the high ground with me. There is no high ground here. West didn't like it, but he had to admit the man made a good case. So he set his jaw and struggled on in silence, head down. They squelched towards a long, windowless, stone-built shed, thick smoke roiling up into the misty air from tall chimneys at each corner. The practical slid back the bolt on the heavy door and heaved it open, and West followed him and Lawson into the darkness. The heat was like a slap in the face after the freezing air outside. Acrid smoke stung at West's eyes, nipped at his throat. The din in the narrow space was frightening. Bellows creaked and wheezed, hammers clanged on anvils, sending up showers of angry sparks. Red-hot metal hissed furiously in water barrels. There were men everywhere, packed in tight together, sweating and groaning and coughing, hollow faces half-lit by the orange glow from the forges. Devils in hell. "Stop your work!" roared Lawson. "Stop and form up!" The men slowly set down their tools, lurched and stumbled and rattled forward to form a line, while 4 or 5 practicals looked on from the shadows. A shabby, broken, stooping, sorrowful line. A couple of the men had irons on their wrists as well as their ankles. They scarcely looked like the answer to all of West's problems, but he had no choice. This was all there was. "We have a visitor from outside. Say your piece, Colonel." "My name is Colonel West," he croaked, voice cracking on the stinging air. "There are 10,000 soldiers camped a dozen miles down the road under Crown Prince Ladislas. We have need of Smiths." West cleared his throat, tried to speak louder without coughing his lungs out. "Who among you can work metals?" No one spoke. The men stared at their threadbare shoes or their bare feet, with the odd sidelong glance at the glowering practicals. "You need not be afraid. Who can work metals?" "I can, sir." A man stepped forward from the line, the irons on his ankles rattling. He was lean and sinewy, slightly stooped. As the lamplight fell across his head, West found himself wincing. He was disfigured by hideous burns. One side of his face was a mass of livid, slightly melted-looking scars. No eyebrow, scalp patchy with pink bald spots. The other side was little better. The man scarcely had a face at all. "I can work a forge, and I did some soldiering too in Gurkle." "Good," muttered West, doing his best to swallow his horror at the man's appearance. "Your name?" "Pike." Are any of these others good with metal, Pike?" The burned man shuffled and clanked his way down the line, pulling men forward by their shoulders, while the commandant looked on, his frown growing deeper with every passing moment. West licked his dry lips. Hard to believe that in so little time he could have gone from so horribly cold to so horribly hot, but here he was, more uncomfortable than ever. "I'll need keys to their irons, Inquisitor." "There are no keys. The irons are melted shut. They're not intended ever to be removed, and I would strongly advise you not to. Many of these prisoners are extremely dangerous, and you should bear in mind that you will be returning them to us as soon as you can make alternative arrangements. The Inquisition is not in the business of early releases." He stalked off to speak to one of the practicals. Pike sidled up, pulling another convict by the elbow. "Pardon me, sir," he murmured, growling voice kept low, "but could you find a place for my daughter?" West shrugged his shoulders, uncomfortable. He would have liked to take everyone and burn the damn place to the ground, but he was already pushing his luck. "It's not a good idea. A woman in amongst all those soldiers. Not a good idea at all." "A better idea than staying here, sir. I can't leave her on her own. She can help me at the forge. She can swing a hammer herself if it comes to that. She's strong." She didn't look strong. She looked skinny and ragged, bony face smeared with soot and grease. West could have taken her for a boy. "I'm sorry, Pike, but it's no easy ride where we're going." She grabbed hold of West's arm as he turned away. "It's no easy ride here." Her voice was a surprise, soft, smooth, educated. "Cathil is my name. I can work." West looked down at her, ready to shake his arm free, but her expression reminded him of something. Painless, fearless, empty eyes, flat like a corpse. Ardy. Blood smeared across her cheek. West grimaced. The memory was like a wound that wouldn't heal. The heat was unbearable. Every part of him was twitching with discomfort, his uniform like sandpaper against his clammy skin. He had to get out of this horrible place. He looked away, his eyes stinging. "Her too," he barked. Lawson snorted. "Are you joking, Colonel?" "Believe me, I'm not in a joking mood." "Skilled men is one thing. I dare say you need them, but I cannot allow you to simply take whatever prisoners catch your eye." West turned on him with a snarl, his patience worn right through. "Her too, I said." If the commandant was impressed by West's fury, he didn't show it. They stood there for a long moment, staring at each other, while the sweat ran down West's face and the blood pounded loud in his temples. Then Lawson nodded slowly. "Her too. Very well, I cannot stop you." He leaned in a little closer. "But the Arch-Lector will hear about this. He is far away, and it might take time for him to hear, but hear he will." Even closer yet, almost whispering in West's ear. "Perhaps one day you will find yourself visiting us again, but this time to stay. Perhaps, in the meantime, you should prepare your little lecture on the rights and wrongs of penal colonies. There'll be plenty of time for it." Lawson turned away. "Now take my prisoners and go. I have a letter to write." Chapter 10. Rain. Giselle had always found a good storm a thorough amusement. Raindrops lashing at the streets and walls and roofs of the Agriont, hissing from the gutters. Something to be smiled out at through the wet window while one sat warm and dry in one's quarters. Something that took the young ladies in the park by surprise and made them squeal, sticking their dresses excitingly to their clammy skin. Something to be dashed through, laughing with one's friends as one made one's way from tavern to tavern before drying out before a roaring fire with a mug of hot spiced wine. Giselle used to enjoy the rain almost as much as the sun. But that was before. Out here on the plains, storms were of a different stamp. This was no petulant child's tantrum, best ignored and soon ended. This was a cold and murderous, merciless and grudge-bearing, bitter and relentless fury of a storm. And somehow it made all the difference that the nearest roof, let alone the nearest tavern, was hundreds of miles behind them. The rain came down in sheets, dousing the endless plain and everything on it with icy water. The fat drops stung at Jazal's scalp like sling stones, nipped at his exposed hands, the tops of his ears, the back of his neck. Water trickled through his hair, through his eyebrows, down his face in rivulets and into his sodden collar. The rain was a grey curtain across the land, obliterating anything more than 100 strides ahead, although out here, of course, there was nothing ahead or anywhere else. Jazal shivered and clutched the collars of his coat together with one hand. A pointless gesture. He was already soaked to his skin. Damn shopkeeper back in Adua had assured him that this coat was entirely waterproof. It had certainly cost him enough, and he had looked very well in it in the shop, quite the rugged outdoorsman. But the seams had begun to leak almost as soon as the first drops fell. For some hours now he had been every bit as wet as if he had climbed into the bath with his clothes on, and a good deal colder. His boots were full of icy water, his thighs were chafed ragged against his wet trousers, the waterlogged saddle creaked and squelched with every movement of his unhappy horse. His nose was running, his nostrils and his lips were sore, the very reins were painful in his wet palms. His nipples, in particular, were 2 points of agony in a sea of discomfort. The whole business was utterly unbearable. "When will it end?" he muttered bitterly to himself, hunching his shoulders and looking up beseechingly at the gloomy heavens, the rain pattering on his face, in his mouth, in his eyes. Happiness seemed at that moment to consist of nothing more than a dry shirt. "Can't you do something?" he moaned at Bayaz. "Like what?" the Magus snapped back at him, water coursing down his face and dripping from his bedraggled beard. "You think I'm enjoying this? Out on the Great Plain in a bastard of a storm at my age? The skies make no special dispensation for magi, boy. They piss on everyone the same. I suggest you adjust to it and keep your whining to yourself. A great leader must share the hardships of his followers, of his soldiers, of his subjects. That is how he wins their respect. Great leaders do not complain, not ever." "Fuck them, then," muttered Jazal under his breath. "And this rain, too." "You call this rain?" Nine Fingers rode past him, a big smile spread across his ugly lump of a face. Not long after the drops began to come down hard, Jazal had been most surprised to see the Northman shrug off first his battered coat and then his shirt, roll them up in an oilskin, and ride on stripped to the waist, heedless of the water running down his great slab of scarred back, happy as a great hog wallowing in the mud. Such behavior had at first struck Jazal as another unforgivable display of savagery, and he had only thanked his stars that the primitive had deigned to keep his trousers on. But as the cold rain began to seep through his coat, he had become less sure. It would have been impossible for him to be any colder or wetter without his clothes, but at least he would have been free of the endless, horrible chafing of wet cloth. Nine Fingers grinned over at him as though he could read his thoughts. "Nothing but a drizzle. The sun can't always shine. You have to be realistic." Jazal ground his teeth. If he was told to be realistic one more time, he would stab Nine Fingers with his short steel. Damn half-naked brute. It was bad enough that he had to ride and eat and sleep within 100 strides of a cave-dweller like that, but that he had to listen to his fool advice was an insult almost too deep to bear. Damn useless primitive, he muttered to himself. If it comes to a fight, I reckon you'll be glad to have him along. Quai was looking sideways at Jazal, swaying back and forth on the seat of his creaking cart, long hair plastered to his gaunt cheeks by the rain, looking more pale and sickly than ever, with a sheen of wet on his white skin. "Who asked your opinion?" A man who doesn't want opinions should keep his own mouth shut. The apprentice nodded his dripping head at Nine Fingers' back. That there is the Bloody Nine, the most feared man in the north. He's killed more men than the plague. Giselle frowned over at the Northman, sitting sloppy in his saddle, thought about it for a moment and sneered. Doesn't scare me any, he said, as loud as he could without Nine Fingers actually hearing him. Quai snorted. I'll bet you've never even drawn a blade in anger. I could start now, growled Giselle, giving his most threatening frown. Very fierce, chuckled the apprentice, disappointingly unimpressed. But if you're asking me who's the useless one here, well, I know who I'd rather have left behind. Why, you... Giselle jumped in his saddle as a bright flash lit the sky, and then another, frighteningly close. Fingers of light clawed at the bulging undersides of the clouds, snaked through the darkness overhead. Long thunder rolled out across the gloomy plain, popped and crackled under the wind. By the time it faded, the wet cart had already rolled away, robbing Giselle of his chance to retort. Damn idiot apprentice, he murmured, frowning at the back of his head. At first, when the flashes had come, Giselle had tried to keep his spirits up by imagining his companions struck down by lightning. It would have been oddly appropriate, for instance, had Baez been cooked to a cinder by a stroke from the heavens. Giselle soon despaired of any such deliverance, however, even as a fantasy. The lightning would never kill more than one of them in a day, and if one of them had to go, he had slowly begun to hope it might be him. A moment of brilliant illumination, then sweet oblivion, the kindest escape from this nightmare. A trickle of water ran down Giselle's back, tickling at his raw skin. He longed to scratch it, but he knew that if he did, he would only create 10 more itches, spread across his shoulder blades and his neck and all the places hardest to reach with a hooked finger. He closed his eyes, and his head slowly drooped under the weight of his desperation until his wet chin hung against his wet chest. It had been raining the last time he saw her. He remembered it all with a painful clarity. The bruise on her face, the color of her eyes, the set of her mouth, one side twisted up. Just thinking of it made him have to swallow that familiar lump in his throat. The lump he swallowed 20 times a day. First thing in the morning when he woke, and last thing at night as he lay on the hard ground. To be back with Ardi now, safe and warm, seemed like the realization of all his dreams. He wondered how long she might wait as the weeks dragged on and she received no word. Might she even now be writing daily letters to Angland that he would never receive? Letters expressing her tender feelings, letters desperately seeking news, letters begging for replies. Now her worst expectations would all be confirmed, that he was a faithless ass and a liar, and had forgotten all about her when nothing could have been further from the truth. He ground his teeth in frustration and despair at the thought, but what could he do? Replies were hard to send from a blighted, blasted, ruined wasteland, even supposing he could have written one in this epic downpour. He inwardly cursed the names of Baez and Nine Fingers, of Longfoot and Quai. He cursed the old empire, and he cursed the endless plain. He cursed the whole demented expedition. It was becoming an hourly ritual. Giselle began to perceive, dimly, that he had until now had rather an easy life. It seemed strange that he had moaned so long and hard about rising early to fence, or about lowering himself to play cards with Lieutenant Brint, or about how his sausages were always a touch overdone of a morning. He should have been laughing, bright-eyed, and with a spring in his step, simply to have been out of the rain. He coughed and sniffed and wiped at his sore nose with his sore hand. At least with so much water around, no one would notice him weeping. Only Pharaoh looked as if she was enjoying herself even less than him, occasionally glaring at the pissing clouds, her face wrinkled up with hatred and horror. Her spiky hair was plastered flat to her skull. Her waterlogged clothes hung limp from her scrawny shoulders. Water ran down her scarred face and dripped from the end of her sharp nose, the point of her sharp chin. She looked like a mean-tempered cat dunked unexpectedly in a pond, its body suddenly seeming a quarter of the size it had been, stripped of all its air of menace. Perhaps a woman's voice might be the thing to lift him from this state of mind, and Pharaoh was the nearest thing to a woman within 100 miles. He spurred his horse up alongside her, doing his best to smile, and she turned her scowl on him. Giselle found to his discomfort that at close quarters much of the menace returned. He had forgotten about those eyes. Yellow eyes, sharp as knives, pupils small as pinpricks, strange and disconcerting. He wished he had never approached her now, but he could hardly go without saying something. "Bet it doesn't rain much where you come from, eh? Are you going to shut your fucking hole, or do I have to hurt you?" Giselle cleared his throat and quietly allowed his mount to drop back away from her. "Crazy bitch," he whispered under his breath. Damn her, then. She could keep her misery. He wasn't about to start wallowing in self-pity. That wasn't his way at all. The rain had finally stopped when they came upon the place, but the air was still full of heavy damp. The sky above was still full of strange colors. The evening sun pierced the swirling clouds with pink and orange, casting an eerie glow over the grey plain. 2 empty carts stood upright. Another was tipped up on its side, one wheel broken off, a dead horse still tethered to it, lying with its pink tongue lolling out of its mouth, a pair of broken arrows sticking from its bloody side. The corpses were scattered all around in the flattened grass, like dolls discarded by a bad-tempered child. Some had deep wounds, or limbs broken, or arrows poking from their bodies. One had an arm off at the shoulder, a short length of snapped bone sticking out as if from a butcher's joint. Rubbish was scattered all around them, broken weapons, splintered wood. A few trunks smashed open, rolls of cloth ripped out and slashed across the wet ground. Burst barrels, shattered boxes, rooted through and looted. "Merchants," grunted Nine Fingers, looking down. "Like we're pretending to be. Life's cheap out here, all right." Pharaoh curled her lip. "Where isn't it?" The wind whipped cold across the plain, cutting clean through Giselle's damp clothes. He had never seen a corpse before, and here were laid out, how many? At least a dozen. He started to feel slightly peculiar halfway through counting them. No one else seemed much moved, though familiarity with violence was hardly surprising among these characters. Pharaoh was crawling around the bodies, peering down and prodding them with as little emotion as an undertaker. Nine Fingers looked as though he had seen far worse, which Giselle did not doubt he had, and done far worse besides. Baez and Longfoot both looked mildly troubled, but not much more so than if they had come upon some unknown horse tracks. Quai scarcely even looked interested. Giselle could have done with a share of their indifference at that moment. He would not have admitted it, but he was feeling more than a little sick. That skin, slack and still and waxy pale, beaded with wet from the rain. That clothing, ripped and rifled through, missing boots or coats or shirts even. Those wounds, ragged red lines, blue and black bruises, rips and tears and gaping mouths in flesh. Giselle turned suddenly in his saddle, looking behind, to the left, to the right, but every view was the same. Nowhere to run to, if he had even known in what direction the nearest settlement lay. In a group of 6, and yet he felt utterly alone. In a vast, open space, and yet he felt utterly trapped. One of the corpses seemed to be staring unnervingly straight at him. A young man, no more than Giselle's age, with sandy hair and protruding ears. He could have done with a shave, except of course that it hardly mattered now. There was a yawning red gash across his belly. his bloody hands lying on either side of it as though trying to squeeze it shut. His guts glistened wetly inside, all purple-red. Giselle felt his gorge rising. He was already feeling faint from eating too little that morning. Damn sick of dry biscuit, and he could hardly force down the slops the others put together. He turned away from the sickening scene and stared down at the grass, pretending to be searching for important clues, while his stomach clenched and heaved. He gripped his reins as tightly as he could, forcing down the spit as it rushed into his mouth. He was a proud son of the Union, damn it! What was more, he was a nobleman of a distinguished family. What was still more, he was a bold officer of the King's Own, and a winner of the contest. To vomit at the sight of a little gore would be to disgrace himself before this mixture of fools and primitives, and that could under no circumstances be permitted. The honor of his nation was at stake. He glared fixedly at the wet ground, and he clamped his teeth shut, and he ordered his stomach to be still. Gradually, it began to work. He sucked in deep breaths through his nose. Cool, damp, calming air. He was in complete control. He looked back at the others. Pharaoh was squatting on the ground with her hand in one of the victim's gaping wounds, as far almost as her wrist. "Cold," she snapped at Nine Fingers. "Been dead since this morning at least." She pulled her hand out, fingers slimy with gore. Giselle had belched half his meager breakfast down his coat before he had time even to slide out of his saddle. He staggered a couple of drunkard steps, took a gasping breath, and retched again. He bent over, hands on his knees, head spinning, spitting bile out onto the grass. "You all right?" Giselle glanced up, doing his best to look nonchalant, with a long string of bitter drool hanging from his face. "Something I ate," he muttered, wiping at his nose and mouth with his trembling hand. A pitiful ruse, he had to admit. Nine Fingers only nodded, though. "That meat this morning, most likely. I've been feeling sick myself." He gave one of his revolting smiles and offered Giselle a water skin. "Best keep drinking. Flush it away, huh?" Giselle sloshed a mouthful of water round his mouth and spat it out, watching Nine Fingers walk back to the bodies and frowning. That had been strange. Coming from another source, it might have seemed almost a generous gesture. He took another swig of water and began to feel better. He made, somewhat unsteadily, for his horse and clambered back into the saddle. "Whoever did it was well armed and in numbers," Pharaoh was saying. "The grass is full of tracks." "We should be careful," said Giselle, hoping to impose himself on the conversation. Baez turned sharply to look at him. "We should always be careful. That goes without saying. How far are we from Damium?" Longfoot squinted up at the sky, then out across the plain. He licked his finger and held it up to the wind. "Even for a man of my talents, it is hard to be accurate without the stars. 50 miles or thereabouts? We'll need to turn off the track soon. We're not crossing the river at Damium. The city is in chaos. Cabrian holds it and admits no one. We cannot take the risk." "Very well. Aeostum it is. We will take a wide route round Damium and off westward. A slightly longer path, but no." "No? The bridge at Aeostum lies in ruins." Longfoot frowned. "Gone, eh? Truly, God loves to test his faithful. We may have to ford the Aeos, then." "No," said Baez. "The rains have been heavy, and the great river is deep. The fords are all closed to us." The navigator looked puzzled. "You, of course, are my employer, and as a proud member of the Order of Navigators, I will always do my utmost to obey, but I am afraid that I can see no other way. If we cannot cross at Damium or at Aeostum, and we cannot ford the river—" "There is one other bridge." "There is?" Longfoot looked baffled for a moment, then his eyes suddenly widened. "You cannot mean—" "The bridge at Alcus still stands." Everyone glanced at each other for a moment, frowning. "I thought you said the place was a ruin," said Nine Fingers. "A shattered graveyard, I heard," murmured Pharaoh. "I thought you said no one goes within miles of the place." "It would hardly have been my first choice, but there are no others. We will join the river and follow the northern bank to Alcus." Nobody moved. Longfoot in particular had a look of stunned horror on his face. "Now," snapped Bias, "it is plainly not safe to remain here." And with that he turned his horse away from the corpses. Quai shrugged and flicked his reins, and the cart grumbled off through the grass after the first of the Magi. Longfoot and Nine Fingers followed behind, all frowns and foreboding. Giselle stared at the bodies, still lying where they had found them, their eyes staring accusingly up into the darkening sky. "Shouldn't we bury them?" "If you like," grunted Pharaoh, springing up into the saddle in one easy motion. "Maybe you could bury them in puke." Chapter 11. Bloody Company. Riding. That was what they were doing. That was what they'd been doing for days. Riding, looking for Bethod, with winter coming on. Bog and forest, hill and valley. Rain and sleet, fog and snow. Looking for signs that he was coming their way, and knowing that there wouldn't be any. A lot of wasted time to the dogman's mind, but once you've been fool enough to ask for a task, you better do the one you're given. "Stupid bloody job, this," snarled Dow, wincing and twitching and fussing with his reins. He'd never been too much of a one for horseback, liked to keep his feet on the ground and pointed at the enemy. "Waste of our fucking time. How do you put up with scouting, dogman? Stupid bloody job." "Someone's got to get it done, don't they? At least I got a horse now." "Well, I'm right delighted for you," he sneered. "You got a horse." The dogman shrugged his shoulders. "Better than walking." "Better than walking, eh?" scoffed Dow. "That just binds it all up." "I got new breeches and all, not to mention good woolens. The wind don't blow half so cold round my fruits no more." That got a chuckle from Tull, but it seemed Dow wasn't in a laughing mood. "Wind round your fruits? By the fucking dead boy, is this what we come to? You forgotten who you are? You was Nine Fingers' closest. You came over the mountains with him in the first place. You're in all them songs along with him. You scouted at the head of armies. 1,000 men all following your say-so." "That didn't turn out too happy for anyone concerned," muttered Dogman, but Dow was already laying into Tull. "And how about you, big man? Tull Duru Thunderhead, strongest bastard in the north. Wrestled bears and won, I heard. Held the pass all alone while your clan got clean away. A giant, they say, 10 feet tall, born under a storm and with a belly full of thunder. What about it, giant? The only thunder I've heard you make lately is when you take a shit." "What of it?" snarled Tull. "You any different? Men used to whisper your name, scared to speak it out loud. They'd grip their weapons tight and stick close by the fire if they thought you was within 10 leagues. Black Dow, they used to say, quiet and cunning and ruthless as a wolf. He's killed more men than Winter, and he's got less pity in him. Who cares a shit now, eh? Times have changed, and you rolled just as far downhill as the rest of us." Dow only smiled. "That's my point, big lad. That's just my point. We used to be something, each one of us. Named men, known men, feared men. I remember my brother telling me that there ain't no better man than Harding Grim with bone or blade. No better man in all the north. Steadiest damn hand in the whole circle of the world. How about that, eh, Grim?" "Aye," said Grim. Dow nodded his head. "Exactly what I'm saying. Now look at us. We ain't so much rolled downhill as fell off a bloody cliff. Running errands for these southerners. These fucking women in men's trousers. These damn salad-eaters with their big words and their thin little swords." Dogman shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. "That West knows what he's about." "That West?" sneered Dow. "He knows his arse from his mouth. And in that he's a damn stretch better than the rest, but he's soft as pig fat, and you know it. Got no bones in him at all. None of them have. I'd be shocked to my roots if the better part of them have ever seen a skirmish. You reckon they'd stand a charge from Bethod's Carls? He snorted hard laughter to himself. Now there's a joke. It can't be denied they're a piss-weak crowd, muttered Tull, and the dog-man couldn't very well disagree. Half of them are too hungry to lift a weapon, let alone swing one with some fire, if they could even work out how. All the good ones went north to fight Bethod, leaving us here with the scrapings from the pot. Scrapings from a piss pot, I'm thinking. What about you, Free Trees? Called Dow. The Rock of Ufrith, eh? You were the spike up Bethod's arse for 6 months. A hero to every right-thinking man in the north. Rud Three Trees. There's a man carved out of stone. There's a man who never backs down. You want honour? You want dignity? You want to know what a man should be? Look no fucking further. What do you make of all this, eh? Running errands? Checking these bogs for Bethod where we all know he ain't? Work fit for boys, and we're lucky to get it, I suppose. Three Trees pulled up his horse and turned it slowly round. He sat in his saddle, hunched up, tired-looking, and he stared at Dow for a minute. Open your ears and listen for once, he said, because I don't want to be telling you this every mile we go. The world ain't how I'd like it in all kind of ways. Nine Fingers has gone back to the mud. Bethod's made himself king of the Northmen. The Shanker are fixing to come swarming over the mountains. I've walked too far and fought too long and heard enough shit from you to fill a lifetime, and all at an age when I should have me feet up with sons to take care of me. So you can see I got bigger problems than that life hasn't turned out the way you hoped. You can harp on the past all you please, Dow, like some old woman upset 'cause her tits used to stay up for themselves, or you can shut your fucking hole and help me get on with things. He gave each one of them a look in the eye, and the dogman felt a touch shamed for doubting him. As for checking for Bethod where he ain't, well, Bethod's never been one to turn up where he's supposed to be. Scouting's the task we've been given, and scouting's the task I mean to get done. He leaned forward in his saddle. So, how's this for a fucking formula? Mouth shut, eyes open. And he turned and nudged his horse on through the trees. Dow took a deep breath. Fair enough, Chief, fair enough. It's just a shame is all. That's what I'm saying. Just a shame. There's 3 of them, said Dogman. Northmen for certain, but hard to tell their clan. Being as they're down here, I'm guessing they follow Bethod. More than likely, said Tull. Seems that's the fashion these days. Just 3? Asked Three Trees. No reason for Bethod to have 3 men on their own all the way out here. Must be more nearby. Let's deal with the 3, growled Dow, and get to the rest later. I came here to fight. You came here 'cause I dragged you here, snapped Three Trees. You was all for turning back an hour ago. Said Grim. We can get around them if we need to. Dogman pointed through the cold woods. They're up on the slope there in the trees. No trouble to get round them. Three Trees looked up at the sky, pink and grey through the branches, and shook his head. No, we're losing the light, and I wouldn't like leaving them behind us in the dark. Since we're here, and since they're here, we'd best deal with them. Weapons it is. He squatted down, talking quiet. Here's how we'll do it. Dogman, get round and above, up on that slope there. Take the one on the left when you hear the signal. You follow me? The one on the left, and best not to miss. Aye, said Dogman. On the left. Not missing, more or less, went without saying. Dow, you slide in quiet and take the middle. The middle, growled Dow. He's done. That leaves one for you, Grim. Grim nodded without looking up, rubbing at his bow with a rag. Nice and clean, boys. I don't want to be putting one of you in the mud over this. Places, then. The dogman found a good spot up above Bethod's 3 scouts and watched from behind a tree trunk. Seemed like he'd done this 100 times, but it never got any easier on the nerves. Probably just as well. It's when it gets easy that a man makes mistakes. Dogman was watching for him, so he just caught sight of Dow in the fading light, slithering up through the brush, eyes fixed ahead on his task. He was getting close now, real close. Dogman knocked an arrow and took an aim at the one on the left, breathing slow to keep his hand steady. It was then that he realized. Now he was on the other side. The one that had been on the left was on the right. So which one should he shoot? He cursed to himself, struggling to remember what Three Trees said. Get around and take the one on the left. Worst thing of all would have been to do nothing, so he aimed up at the one on his left and hoped for the best. He heard Three Trees call from down below, sounding like a bird out in the woods. Dow gathered himself to jump. Dogman let his arrow fly. It thudded into the back of his task just as Grim's arrow stuck him in the front, and Dow seized hold of the middle one and stabbed him from behind. That left one of them untouched and very surprised looking. "Shit," whispered the Dogman. "Help!" screamed the last of them before Dow jumped on him. They rolled in the leaves, grunting and thrashing. Dow's arm went up and down, once, twice, 3 times. Then he stood up, glaring through the trees and looking mighty annoyed. Dogman was just shrugging his shoulders when he heard a voice behind him. "What?" Dogman froze, cold all over. Another one, out in the bushes, not 10 strides away. He reached for an arrow and knocked it, real quiet, then turned slowly round. He saw 2 of them, and they saw him, and his mouth went sour as old beer. They all stared. Dogman aimed at the bigger one and pulled the string right back. "No!" he shouted. The arrow thudded into his chest, and he groaned and stumbled, fell down on his knees. Dogman dropped his bow and made a snatch at his knife, but he hadn't got it drawn before the other one was on him. They went down hard in the brush and started rolling. Light, dark, over and over they went down the slope, kicking and tearing and punching at each other. Dogman's head smacked against something, and he was down on his back, wrestling with this bastard. They hissed at each other, not words exactly, sounds like dogs make fighting. The man pulled his hand free and got a blade out from somewhere, and Dogman caught his wrist before he could stab it home. He was pushing down with all his weight, both hands on the knife. Dogman was pushing the other way, both hands on his wrists, hard as he could, but not hard enough. The blade was coming down slowly, down towards Dogman's face. He was staring at it cross-eyed, a tooth of bright metal not a foot from his nose. "Die, you fucker!" And it came down another inch. The Dogman's shoulders, his arms, his hands were burning, running out of strength. Staring at his face, stubble on his chin, yellow teeth, pockmarks on his bent nose, hair hanging down around it. The point of the blade nudged closer. Dogman was dead, and there was no help for it. Snick. And his head wasn't there anymore. Blood washed over Dogman's face, hot and sticky and reeking. The corpse went slack, and he shoved it away. Blood in his eyes, blood up his nose, blood in his mouth. He staggered up, gasping and choking and spitting. "All right, Dogman, you're all right." Tull must have come up on them while they were struggling. "I'm still alive," Dogman whispered, the way Logan used to when a fight was done. "Still alive." By the dead, though, that had been a close thing. "They ain't got too much in the way of gear," Dow was saying, poking round the campsite. Cookpot on the fire, weapons and such like, but not much food, not enough to be all alone out there in the woods. "Scouts, maybe," said Three Trees. "Outriders for some bigger band." "Reckon they must be," said Dow. Three Trees slapped his hand down on the Dogman's shoulder. "You all right?" He was still busy trying to rub the blood off his face. I think so." Bit shaky still, but that would settle. "Cuts and scrapes, I reckon. Nothing I'll die of." "Good, because I can't spare you. Why don't you take a creep up through them trees and have a look-see while we clear up this mess here? Find who these bastards were scouting for." "Right enough," said the Dogman, sucking in a big breath and blowing it out. "Right enough." Stupid bloody job, eh, Dow? Whispered Three Trees. Work fit for boys, and we're lucky to get it. What do you say now? Could be I made a mistake. A big one, said the Dog Man. There were 100 fires burning down there on the dark slopes, 100 fires and more. There were men down there too, it hardly needed saying. Thralls mostly, lightly armed, but plenty of carls as well. Dogman could see the last light of the day glinting on their spear tips and their shield rims and their mail coats, polished up and ready for a fight, clustered round close to the flapping standards of each clan's chieftain. Lots of standards, 20 of them, or 30 even at a quick count. The Dogman had never seen more than 10 together before. Biggest army that's ever been out of the north, he muttered. Aye, said Three Trees. All fighting for Bethod, and not 5 days' ride from the Southerners. He pointed down at one of the banners. That little bone standard down there. Aye, growled Dow and spat into the brush. That's his mark, all right. I got scores with that bastard. There's a world of scores down there, said Three Trees. That's Pale of Snow's banner, and Whiteside's, and Crendel Goring's over by them rocks. That's some bloody company. Them as went over to Bethod near the beginning. All grown fat on it now, I reckon. What about them ones? Asked the Dogman, pointing out at some that he didn't recognize. Evil-looking signs, all leather and bones. Looked like hillmen's marks to him, maybe. That ain't Cromarty Fale's standard, is it? Nah, he'd never have kneeled to Bethod or anyone else. That mad bastard'll still be up there in the mountains somewhere, calling to the moon and all the rest. Less Bethod done for him, grunted Dow. Three Trees shook his head. Doubt it. Canny bastard, that Crummock. Been holding Bethod off for years up in the high places. He knows all the ways, they say. Whose signs are they then? Asked Dogman. Don't know. Could be some boys from out east, past the Grinner. There's some strange folk out that way. You know any of them banners, Grim? Aye, said Grim, but that was all he said. Don't hardly matter whose signs they are, muttered Dow. Just look at the numbers of them. There's half the fucking north down there. And the worst half, said Dogman. He was looking at Bethod's sign set up in the middle of the host. A red circle daubed on black hides, an acre of them, it looked like, big as a field, mounted on a tall pine trunk, flapping evil in the wind. Huge great thing. Wouldn't fancy carrying it, he muttered. Dow slithered over and leaned in close. Might be that we could sneak in there in the dark, he whispered. Might be we could sneak in and put a blade in Bethod. They all looked at each other. It was a terrible risk, but Dogman had no doubts it was worth the trying. Wasn't a one of them hadn't dreamed of sending Bethod back to the mud. Put a blade in him, the bastard, muttered Tull, and he had a smile right across his face. Aye, grunted Grim. That's a task worth doing, hissed Dow. That's real work. Dogman nodded, looking down at all them fires. No doubt. Noble work. Work for named men like them, or like they used to be, maybe. There'd be some songs about that, all right. Dogman's blood was rushing at the thought, skin prickling on his hands. But Three Trees was having none of it. No, we can't risk it. We gotta go back and tell the Union. Tell them they got guests coming. Bad guests, and in numbers. He tugged at his beard, and Dogman could tell he didn't like it, backing off. None of them did, but they knew he was right, even Dow. Chances were they'd never get to Bethod, and if they did, they'd never get out. We gotta go back, said Dogman. Fair enough, said Dow. We go back. Shame, though. Aye, said Three Trees. Shame. Chapter 12. Long Shadows. By the dead. Pharaoh said nothing, but for the first time since Logan met her, the scowl had slipped off. Her face was slack, mouth hanging slightly open. Lothar, on the other hand, was grinning like a fool. "You ever see anything like that?" he shouted over the noise, pointing out at it with a trembling hand. "There is nothing else like that," said Bias. Logan had to admit that he'd been wondering what all the fuss was about when it came to crossing a river. Some of the bigger ones in the north could be a problem, especially in the wrong season and with a lot of gear to carry. But if there was no bridge, you found a good ford, held your weapons over your head and sloshed across. Might take a while for your boots to dry out, and you had to keep your eyes well opened for an ambush, but otherwise there was nothing much to fear from a river. Good place to fill your water skin. Filling your skin at the Eos would have been a dangerous business, at least without 100 strides of rope. Logan had once stood on the cliffs near Ufrith and watched the waves crash against the rocks far below, the sea stretching away, grey and foaming out of sight. A dizzy and a humbling and a worrying place to stand. The feeling at the brink of the Great River's canyon was much the same, except that a quarter-mile away or so, another cliff rose up from the water. The far bank, if you could use the word about a towering rock face. He shuffled up gingerly to the very edge, prodding at the soft ground with the toes of his boots, and peered over the brink. Not a good idea. The red earth overhung slightly, bound up with white grass roots, and then the jagged rocks dropped away, almost sheer. Where the frothing water slapped against them far below, it sent great plumes of bright spray into the air, clouds of damp mist that Logan could almost feel on his face. Tufts of long grass clung to the cracks and the ledges, and birds flitted between them, hundreds of small white birds. Logan could just make out their twittering calls over the mighty rumble of the river. He thought on being dropped into that thundering weight of dark water, sucked and whirled and ripped around like a leaf in the storm. He swallowed and shuffled cautiously back from the edge, looking around for something to cling onto. He felt tiny and weightless, as if a strong gust of wind might snatch him away. He could almost feel the water moving through his boots, the surging, rolling, unstoppable power of it, making the very earth tremble. "So you can see why a bridge might be such a good idea," shouted Bias in his ear. "How can you even build a bridge across that?" "At Aeostum, the river splits in three, and the canyon is much less deep. The Emperor's architects built islands and made their bridges of many small arches. Even so, it took them 12 years to build. The bridge at Damium is the work of Canadius himself, a gift to his brother Juvens when they were yet on good terms. It crosses the river in a single span. How he did it, none now can say." Bias turned for the horses. "Get the others, we should keep moving." Pharaoh was already walking back from the brink. "So much rain." She looked over her shoulder, frowned, and shook her head. "Don't get rivers like that where you come from, eh?" "Out in the Badlands, water is the most precious thing you can have. Men kill over a bottle of it." "That's where you were born, the Badlands?" A strange name for a place, but it sounded about right for her. "There are no births in the Badlands, Pink, only deaths." "Harsh land, eh? Where were you born, then?" She scowled. "What do you care?" "Just trying to be friendly." "Friends," she sneered, brushing past him towards the horses. "Why? You got so many out here you couldn't use another?" She stopped, half-turned, and looked at him through narrowed eyes. "My friends don't last, Pink." "Nor do mine, but I reckon I'll take the risk if you will." "All right," she said, but there was nothing friendly in her face. "The Gurkish conquered my home when I was a child, and they took me for a slave. They took all the children." "A slave?" "Yes, fool, a slave. Bought and sold like meat by the butcher. Owned by someone else, and they do as they please with you, like they would with a goat or a dog or the dirt in their gardens. That what you want to know, friend? Logan frowned. We don't have that custom in the north. Sst, she hissed, lip curling with scorn. Good for fucking you. The ruin loomed over them. A forest of shattered pillars, a maze of broken walls, the ground around it strewn with fallen blocks as long as a man was tall. Crumbling windows and empty doorways yawned like wounds. A ragged black outline chopped out from the flying clouds like a giant row of broken teeth. What city was this? Asked Luther. No city, said Baez. At the height of the old time, at the greatest extent of the Emperor's power, this was his winter palace. All this? Logan squinted at the sprawling wreck. One man's house? And not even the whole year round. Most of the time, the court would stay in Alcus. In winter, when the cold snows swept down off the mountains, the Emperor would bring his retinue here. An army of guardsmen, of servants, of cooks, of officials, of princes, and children and wives, making their way across the plain ahead of the cold winds, taking up residence here for 3 short months in the echoing halls, the beautiful gardens, the gilded chambers. Baez shook his bald head. In times long past, before the war, this place glittered like the sea beneath the rising sun. Luther sniffed. So, Lestrade tore it down, I suppose? No. It was not in that war, but another that it fell many years later. A war fought by my order after the death of Juvens against his eldest brother. Canadius, muttered Quai, the Master Maker. A war just as bitter, just as brutal, just as merciless as the one before, and even more was lost. Juvens and Canadius both in the end. Not a happy family, muttered Logan. No. Baez frowned up at the mighty wreckage. With the death of the Maker, the last of the 4 sons of Eos, the old time ended. We are left only with the ruins and the tombs and the myths. Little men kneeling in the long shadows of the past. Pharaoh stood up in her stirrups. There are riders, she barked, staring off at the horizon. 40 or more. Where? Snapped Baez, shading his eyes. I don't see anything. Nor could Logan. Only the waving grass and the towering clouds. Longfoot frowned. I see no riders, and I am blessed with perfect vision. Why, I have often been told that— You want to wait until you see them? Hissed Pharaoh, or get off the road before they see us. We'll head into the ruins, snapped Baez over his shoulder, and wait for them to pass. Malicus, turn the cart. The wreck of the Winter Palace was full of shadows and stillness and decay. The outsize ruins towered around them, all covered with old ivy and wet moss, streaked and crusted with the droppings of bird and bat. The animals had made the place their palace now. Birds sang from 1,000 nests high in the ancient masonry. Spiders had spun great glistening webs in leaning doorways, heavy with sparkling beads of dew. Tiny lizards sunned themselves in patches of light on the fallen blocks, swarming away as they came near. The rattling of the cart over the broken ground, the footfalls and the hoofbeats echoed back from the slimy stones. Everywhere water dripped and ran and plopped in hidden pools. Take this, Pink. Pharaoh slapped her sword into Logan's hands. Where are you going? You wait down here and stay out of sight. She jerked her head upwards. I'll watch them from up there. As a boy, Logan had never been out of the trees round the village. As a young man, he'd spent days in the high places, testing himself against the mountains. At Hionan in the winter, the hillmen had held the high pass. Even Bethod had thought that there was no way round, but Logan had found a way up the frozen cliff and settled that score. He could see no way up here, though, not without an hour or two to spare. Cliffs of leaning blocks, heavy with dead creeper, crags of tottering stonework, slick with moss, seeming to lean and tip as the clouds moved fast above. How the hell you planning to get up? She was already halfway up one of the pillars. She didn't so much climb as swarm like an insect, hand over hand. She paused at the top for a moment, found a footing she liked, then sprang through the air, right over Logan's head, landed on the wall behind, and scrambled up onto it, sending a shower of broken mortar down into his face. She squatted on the top and frowned down at him. "Just try not to make too much noise," she hissed, then was gone. "Did you see?" muttered Logan, but the others had already moved further into the damp shadows, and he hurried after them, not wanting to be left alone in this overgrown graveyard. Quai had pulled his cart up further on and was leaning against it beside the restless horses. The first of the Magi was kneeling near him in the weeds, rubbing at the lichen-crusted wall with his palms. "Look at this," snapped Baez as Logan tried to edge past. "These carvings here, masterpieces of the ancient world, stories and lessons and warnings from history." His thick fingers brushed gently at the scarred stone. "We might be the first men to look upon these in centuries." Muttered Logan, puffing out his cheeks. "Look here." Baez gestured at the wall. "Eowers gives his gifts to his 3 oldest sons, while Glustrod looks on from the shadows. The birth of the 3 pure disciplines of magic. Some craftsmanship, eh?" "Right." "And here," grunted Baez, knocking some weeds away and shuffling along to the next mossy panel, "Glustrod plans to destroy his brother's work." He had to tear at a tangle of dead ivy to get at the one beyond. "He breaks the first law. He hears voices from the world below, you see? He summons devils and sends them against his enemies. And in this one," he muttered, tugging at the weight of brown creeper, "let me see now. Glustrod digs," muttered Quai. "Who knows? In the next one, he might even have found what he's looking for." Grumbled the first of the Magi, letting the ivy fall back across the wall. He glowered at his apprentice as he stood up, frowning. "Perhaps sometimes the past is better left covered." Logan cleared his throat and edged away, ducked quickly under a leaning archway. The wide space beyond was filled with small, knotty trees planted in rows, but long overgrown. Great weeds and nettles, brown and sagging rotten from the rain, stood almost waist-high around the mossy walls. "Perhaps I should not say it myself," came Longfoot's cheerful voice, "but it must be said, my talent for navigation stands alone. It rises above the skills of every other navigator as the mountain rises over the deep valley." Logan winced, but it was Baez's anger or Longfoot's bragging, and that was no choice at all. "I have led us across the Great Plain to the River Eos without a deviation of even a mile." The navigator beamed at Logan and Luther as though expecting an avalanche of praise. "And without a single dangerous encounter in a land reckoned among the most dangerous under the sun." He frowned. "Perhaps a quarter of our epic journey is now safely behind us. I am not sure that you appreciate the difficulty involved. Across the featureless plain as autumn turns to winter and without even the stars to reckon by." He shook his head. "Truly, the pinnacle of achievement is a lonely place." He turned away and wandered over to one of the trees. "The lodgings are a little past their best, but at least the fruit trees are still in working order." Longfoot plucked a green apple from a low-hanging branch and began to shine it on his sleeve. "Nothing like a fine apple, and from the Emperor's orchard, no less." He grinned to himself. "Strange, eh? How the plants outlast the greatest works of men." Luther sat down on a fallen statue nearby, slid the longer of his 2 swords from its sheath, and laid it across his knees. Steel glinted mirror-bright as he turned it over in his lap, frowned at it, licked a finger, and scrubbed at some invisible blemish. He pulled out his whetstone, spat on it, and carefully set to work on the long, thin blade. The metal rang gently as the stone moved back and forward. It was soothing somehow, that sound, that ritual, familiar from 1,000 campfires of Logan's past. "Must you?" asked Brother Longfoot. "Sharpening, polishing, morning and night. It makes my head hurt. It's not as if you've even made any use of them yet. Probably find when you need them that you've sharpened them away to nothing, eh?" He chuckled at his own joke. "Where will you be then?" Luther didn't even bother to look up. "Why don't you keep your mind on getting us across this damn plain and leave the swords to those who know the difference?" Logan grinned to himself. An argument between the 2 most arrogant men he had ever met was well worth watching, in his opinion. "Huh," snorted Longfoot. "Show me someone who knows the difference, and I'll happily never mention blades again." He lifted the apple to his mouth, but before he could bite into it, his hand was empty. Luther had moved almost too fast to follow and speared it on the glinting point of his sword. "Give me that back!" Luther stood up. "Of course." He tossed it off the end of the blade with a practiced flick of his wrist. Before Longfoot's reaching hands could close around it, Luther had snatched his short sword from its sheath and whipped it blurring through the air. The navigator was left juggling with the 2 even halves for a moment before dropping them both in the dirt. "Damn your showing off!" he snapped. "We can't all have your modesty," muttered Luther. Logan chuckled to himself while Longfoot stomped back over to the tree, staring up into the branches for another apple. "Nice trick," he grunted, strolling through the weeds to where Luther was sitting. "You're quick with those needles." The young man gave a modest shrug. "It has been remarked upon." Stabbing an apple and stabbing a man were 2 different things, but quickness was some kind of start. Logan looked down at Pharaoh's sword, turned it over in his hands, then slid it out from its wooden sheath. It was a strange weapon to his mind, grip and blade both gently curved, thicker at the end than at the hilt, sharpened only down one edge, with scarcely any point on it at all. He swung it in the air a couple of times. Strange weight, more like an axe than a sword. "Odd-looking thing," muttered Luther. Logan checked the edge with his thumb. Rough feeling, it dragged at the skin. "Sharp, though. Don't you ever sharpen yours?" Logan frowned. He reckoned he must have spent weeks of his life, all told, sharpening the weapons he'd carried. Every night out on the trail, after the meal, men would sit and work at their gear, steel scraping on metal and stone, flashing in the light of the campfires. Sharpening, cleaning, polishing, tightening. His hair might have been caked with mud, his skin stiff with old sweat, his clothes riddled with lice, but his weapons had always gleamed like the new moon. He took hold of the cold grip and pulled the sword that Baez had given him out of its stained scabbard. It looked a slow and ugly thing compared to Luther's swords, and to Pharaoh's too, if it came to that. There was hardly any shine on the heavy grey blade at all. He turned it over in his hand. The single silver letter glinted near the hilt, the mark of Canadius. Don't know why, but it doesn't need sharpening. I tried it to begin with, but all it did was wear down the stone. Longfoot had hauled himself up into one of the trees and was slithering along a thick branch towards an apple hanging out of reach near its end. "If you ask me," grunted the navigator, "the weapons suit their owners to the ground. Captain Luther, flash and fine-looking, but never used in combat. The woman Malgin, sharp and vicious and worrying to look upon. The Northman, Nine Fingers, heavy, solid, slow, and simple." "Ha!" he chuckled, dragging himself slightly further down the limb. "A most fitting metaphor. Juggling with words has always been but one among my many remarkable—" Logan grunted as he swung the sword over his head. It bit through the branch where it met the trunk, clean through, almost to the other side. More than far enough that Longfoot's weight ripped through the rest and brought the whole limb, navigator and all, crashing down into the weeds below. "Slow and simple enough for you?" Luthar spluttered with laughter as he sharpened his short sword, and Logan laughed as well. Laughing with a man was a good step forward. First comes the laughter, then the respect, then the trust. "God's breath!" shouted Longfoot, scrabbling his way out from under the branch. "Can a man not eat without disturbance?" "Sharp enough," chuckled Luthar. "No doubt." Logan hefted the sword in his hand. Yes, this Canadius knew how to make a weapon all right. Making weapons is what Canadius did. Baez had stepped through the crumbling archway and into the overgrown orchard. He was the master maker, after all. The one that you hold is among the very least of what he made, forged to be used in a war against his brothers. "Brothers," snorted Luthar. "I know exactly how he felt. There's always something, usually a woman in my experience." He gave his short sword one last stroke with the whetstone. "And where women are concerned, I always come out on top." "Is that so?" Baez snorted. "As it happens, a woman did enter the case, but not in the way you're thinking." Luthar gave a sickening grin. "What other way is there to think about women? If you ask me, gah!" A large clod of bird shit splattered against the shoulder of his coat, throwing specks of black and grey all over his hair, his face, his newly cleaned swords. "What the—" He scrambled from his seat and stared up at the wall above him. Ferro was squatting on top, wiping her hand on a spray of ivy. It was hard to tell with the bright sky behind, but Logan wondered if she might not have the trace of a smile on her face. Luthar certainly wasn't smiling. "You fucking mad bitch!" he screamed, scraping the white goo from his coat and flinging it at the wall. "Bunch of bloody savages!" And he shoved angrily past and through the fallen arch. Laughter was one thing, it seemed, but the respect might be a while coming. "In case any of you pinks are interested," called Ferro, "the riders are gone." "Which way?" asked Baez. "Away east, the way we came, riding hard." "Looking for us?" "Who knows? They didn't have signs. But if they are looking, more than likely they will find our trail." The Magus frowned. "Then you'd best get down from there. We need to move." He thought about it for a moment. "And try not to throw any more shit." Chapter 13. And next, my gold.
To Sandan Gloctor, superior of Dagoska, and for his eyes alone. I am most troubled to discover that you think yourself short of both men and money. As far as soldiers are concerned, you must make do with what you have or what you can procure. As you're already well aware, the great majority of our strength is committed in Angland. Unfortunately, a certain rebellious temper among the peasantry throughout Midderland is more than occupying what remains. As to the question of funds, I fear that nothing can be spared. You will not ask again. I advise you to squeeze what you can from the spicers, from the natives, from anyone else who is to hand. Borrow and make do, Gloctor. Demonstrate that resourcefulness that made you so famous in the Cantic War. I trust that you will not disappoint me. Salt, Archlector of His Majesty's Inquisition.
Matters proceed with the greatest speed, Superior, if I may say so. Since the gates to the upper city were opened, the work rate of the natives has tripled. The ditch is down below sea level across the entire peninsula and deepening every day. Only narrow dams hold back the brine at either end, and at your order, the entire business is ready to be flooded. Visbrook sat back with a happy smile on his plump face, quite as if the whole thing had been his idea. Below them in the upper city, the morning chanting was beginning. A strange wailing that drifted from the spires of the great temple out over Dagosca and into every building, even here in the audience chamber of the citadel. Kadia calls his people to prayer. Worm's lip curled at the sound. That time again already? Damn those natives and their bloody superstitions. We should never have let them back into their temple. Damn their bloody chanting. It gives me a headache. And it's worth it for that alone. Gloctor grinned. If it makes Kadia happy, your headache is something I can live with. Like it or not, we need the natives. And the natives like to chant. Get used to it is my advice. That or wrap a blanket round your head. Visbrook sat back in his chair and listened while Worm sulked. I have to admit that I find the sound rather soothing, and we cannot deny the effect the Superior's concessions have had on the natives. With their help, the land walls are repaired, the gates are replaced, and the scaffolds are already being dismantled. Stone has been acquired for new parapets, but... and here is the problem. The masons refuse to work another day without money. My soldiers are on quarter pay, and morale is low. Debt is the problem, Superior. I'll say it is, muttered Worms angrily. The granaries are close to capacity, and 2 new wells have been dug in the lower city at great expense, but my credit is utterly exhausted. The grain merchants are after my blood. A damn sight less keenly than every merchant in the city is after mine, I dare say. I can scarcely show my face any longer for their clamoring. My reputation is in jeopardy, Superior. As if I had no larger concerns than the reputation of this dolt. How much do we owe? Worms frowned. For food, water, and general equipment, no less than 100,000. 100,000? The spicers love making money, but they hate spending it more. Ida will not come up with half so much if she even chooses to try. What about you, General? The cost of hiring mercenaries, excavating the ditch, of the repairs to the walls, of extra weapons, armor, ammunition. Visbrook puffed out his cheeks. In all, it comes to nearly 400,000 marks. It was the most Gloctor could do to keep from choking on his own tongue. 500,000? A king's ransom and more besides. I doubt that Salt could provide so much even if he had the mind, and he does not. Men die all the time over debts a fraction of the size. Work however you can. Promise whatever you want. The money is on its way, I assure you. The general was already collecting his notes. I am doing all I can, but people are beginning to doubt that they will ever be paid. Worms was more direct. No one trusts us any longer. Without money, we can do nothing. Nothing, growled Severard. Frost slowly shook his head. Gloctor rubbed at his sore eyes. A superior of the Inquisition vanisheth without leaving so much as a smear behind. He retires to his chambers at night. The door is locked. In the morning, he does not answer. They break down the door and find nothing. The bed has been slept in, but there is no body, not the slightest sign of a struggle even. Nothing, muttered Severard. What do we know? De Voost suspected a conspiracy within the city, a traitor intending to deliver Dagosca to the Gurkish. He believed a member of the ruling council was involved. It would seem likely that he uncovered the identity of this person and was somehow silenced. But who? We must turn the question on its head. If we cannot find our traitor, we must make them come to us. If they work to get the Gurkish in, we need only succeed in keeping them out. Sooner or later, they will show themselves.
Risky,
mumbled Frost. Risky indeed, especially for Dagosca's latest superior of the Inquisition, but we have no choices. So, we wait? Asked Severard. We wait, and we look to our defences. That, and we try to find some money. Do you have any cash, Severard? I did have some. I gave it to a girl down in the slums. Ah, shame. Not really. She fucks like a madman. I'd thoroughly recommend her if you're interested. Gloctor winced as his knee clicked. What a thoroughly heart-warming tale, Severard. I never had you down for a romantic. I'd sing a ballad if I wasn't so short of funds. I could ask around. How much are we talking about? Oh, not much. Say, 500,000 marks. One of the practical's eyebrows went up sharply. He reached into his pocket, dug around for a moment, pulled his hand out and opened it. A few copper coins shone in his palm. 12 bits, he said. 12 bits is all I can raise. 12,000 is all I can raise, said Magister Ida. Scarcely a drop in the bucket. My guild are nervous. Business has not been good. The great majority of their assets are bound up in ventures of one kind or another. I have little cash to hand either. I dare say you have a good deal more than 12,000, but what's the difference? I doubt even you have 500,000 tucked away. There probably isn't that amount in the whole city. One would almost think they didn't like me. She snorted. Turning them out of the temple, arming the natives, then demanding money. It might be fair to say you're not their favorite person. Might it be fair to say they're after my blood? And plenty of it, I shouldn't wonder. It might, but for the time being at least, I think I've managed to convince them that you're a good thing for the city. She looked levelly at him for a moment. You are a good thing, aren't you? If keeping the Gurkish out is your priority, that is our priority, isn't it? More money wouldn't hurt, though. More money never hurts, but that's the trouble with merchants. They much prefer making it to spending it, even when it's in their own best interests. She gave a heavy sigh, rapped her fingernails on the table, looked down at her hand. She seemed to consider a moment. Then she began to pull the rings from her fingers. When she had finally got them all off, she tossed them into the box along with the coins. Gloctor frowned. A winning gesture, Magister, but I could not possibly. I insist, she said, unclasping her heavy necklace and dropping it into the box. I can always get more once you've saved the city. In any case, they'll do me no good when the Gurkish rip them from my corpse, will they? She slipped her heavy bracelets off her wrists, yellow gold studded with green gemstones. They rattled down amongst the rest. Take the jewels before I change my mind. A man lost in the desert should take such water as he is offered, regardless of the source. Kadia told me the very same thing. Kadia is a clever man. He is. I thank you for your generosity, Magister. Gloctor snapped the lid of the box shut. The least I could do. She got up from her chair and walked to the door, her sandals hissing across the carpet. I will speak with you soon. He says he must speak with you now. What was his name, Schickel? Malthus, a banker. One more creditor come clamoring for his money. Sooner or later, I'll have to just arrest the pack of them. That will be the end of my little spending spree, but it will almost be worth it to see the looks on their faces. Gloctor gave a hopeless shrug. Send him in. He was a tall man in his 50s, almost ill-looking in his gauntness, hollow-cheeked and sunken-eyed. There was a stern precision to his movements, a steady coldness to his gaze. as though he is weighing the value of all he looks at in silver marks, including me. My name is Malthus. I was informed, but I'm afraid that there are no funds available at the present moment, unless you count Severard's 12 bits. Whatever debts the city has with your bank will have to wait. It will not be for much longer, I assure you. Just until the sea dries up, the sky falls in, and devils roam the earth. Malthus gave a smile, if you could call it that, a neat, precise, and utterly joyless curving of the mouth. You misunderstand me, Superior Gloctor. I have not come to collect a debt. For 7 years I have had the privilege of acting as the chief representative in Dagosca of the banking house of Valent and Bulk. Gloctor paused, then tried to sound offhand. Valent and Bulk, you say? Your bank financed the Guild of Mercers, I believe. We had some dealings with that guild before their unfortunate fall from grace. I'll say you did. You owned them from the ground up. But then we have dealings with many guilds and companies and other banks, and individuals, great and small. Today, I have dealings with you. Dealings of what nature? Malthus turned to the door and snapped his fingers. 2 burly natives entered, grunting, sweating, struggling under the weight of a great casket, a box of polished black wood bound with bands of bright steel sealed with a heavy lock. They set it down carefully on the fine carpet, wiped sweat from their foreheads, and tramped out the way they came, while Gloctor frowned after them. What is this? Malthus pulled a key from his pocket and turned it in the lock. He reached forward and lifted the lid of the chest. He moved out of the way, carefully and precisely, so Gloctor could see the contents. 150,000 marks in silver. Gloctor blinked. And so it is. The coins flashed and glittered in the evening light, flat, round, silver 5-mark pieces. Not a jingling heap, not some barbarian's hoard. Neat, even stacks held in place by wooden dowels. As neat and even as Malthus himself. The 2 porters were gasping their way back into the room, carrying between them a second box, slightly smaller than the first. They placed it on the floor and strode out, not so much as glancing at the fortune glittering in plain view beside them. Malthus unlocked the second chest with the same key, raised the lid, and stood aside. 350,000 marks in gold. Gloctor knew his mouth was open, but he could not close it. Bright, clean gold, glowing yellow. All that wealth seemed almost to give off warmth, like a bonfire. It tugged at him, dragged at him, pulled him forward. He took a hesitant step, in fact, before he stopped himself. Great, big, golden 50-mark pieces. Neat, even stacks just as before. Most men would never in their lives see such coins. Few men, indeed, can ever have seen so many. Malthus reached into his coat and pulled out a flat leather case. He placed it carefully on the table and unfolded it. Once, twice, 3 times. 1/2 of 1 million marks in polished stones. There they lay on the soft black leather, on the hard brown tabletop, burning with all the colors under the sun. 2 large handfuls, perhaps, of multicolored, glittering gravel. Gloctor stared down at them, numb, and sucked at his gums. Magister Ida's jewels seem suddenly rather quaint. In total, I have been ordered by my superiors to advance to you, Sandan Gloctor, Superior of Dagosca, the sum of precisely 1 million marks. He unrolled a heavy paper. You will sign here. Gloctor stared from one chest to another and back. His left eye gave a flurry of twitches. Why? To certify that you received the money. Gloctor almost laughed. Not that. Why the money? He flailed one hand at it all. "Why all this?" "It would appear that my employers share your concern that Dagoska should not fall to the Gurkish. More than that, I cannot tell you." "Cannot or will not?" "Cannot. Will not." Gloctor frowned at the jewels, at the silver, at the gold. His leg was throbbing dully. All that I wanted and far more. But banks do not become banks by giving money away. "If this is a loan, what is the interest?" Malthus flashed his icy smile again. "My employers would prefer to call it a contribution to the defense of the city. There is one condition, however, which is, it may be that in the future a representative of the banking house of Valentin Bulk will come to you requesting favors. It is the most earnest hope of my employers that, if and when that time comes, you will not disappoint them. 1,000,000 marks worth of favors, and I place myself in the power of a most suspect organization, an organization whose motives I do not begin to understand, an organization that, until recently, I was on the point of investigating for high treason. But what are my options? Without money, the city is lost, and I am finished. I needed a miracle, and here it is, sparkling before me. A man lost in the desert must take such water as is offered." Malthus slid the document across the table. Several blocks of neat writing and a space for a name. For my name. Not at all unlike a paper of confession, and prisoners always sign their confessions. They are only offered when there is no choice. Gloctor reached for the pen, dipped it in the ink, wrote his name in the space provided. "That concludes our business." Malthus rolled up the document smoothly and precisely. He slipped it carefully into his coat. "My colleagues and I are leaving Dagoska this evening." A great deal of money to contribute to the cause, but precious little confidence in it. "Valentin Bulk are closing their offices here, but perhaps we will meet in Adua once this unfortunate situation with the Gurkish is resolved." The man gave his mechanical smile one more time. "Don't spend it all at once." And he turned on his heel and strode out, leaving Gloctor alone with his monumental windfall. He shuffled over to it, breathing hard, and stared down. There was something obscene about all that money, something disgusting, something frightening almost. He snapped shut the lids of the two chests. He locked them with trembling hands. He shoved the key in his inside pocket. He stroked the metal bindings of the two boxes with his fingertips. His palms were greasy with sweat. "I am rich." He picked up a clear, cut stone the size of an acorn and held it up to the window between finger and thumb. The dim light shone back at him through the many facets, 1,000 brilliant sparks of fire, blue, green, red, white. Gloctor did not know much about gemstones, but he was reasonably sure that this one was a diamond. "I am very, very rich." He looked back at the rest, sparkling on the flat piece of leather. Some of them were small, but many were not. Several were larger than the one he held in his hand. "I am immensely, fabulously wealthy. Imagine what one could do with so much money. Imagine what one could control. Perhaps with this much, I can save the city. More walls, more supplies, more equipment, more mercenaries. The Gurkish thrown back from Dagoska in disarray. The Emperor of Gurkel humbled. Who would have thought it? Sandan Gloctor, once more the hero." He rolled the shining little pebbles around with a fingertip, lost in thought. But so much spending in so little time could raise questions. My faithful servant, Practical Vitari, would be curious, and she would make my noble master the Archlector curious. One day I beg for money, the next I spend it as if it burns. I was forced to borrow, Your Eminence. Indeed, how much? No more than 1,000,000 marks. Indeed, and who would lend such a sum? Why, our old friends at the banking house of Valentin Bulk, Your Eminence, in return for unspecified favors which they might call in at any moment. Of course, my loyalty is still beyond question. You understand, don't you? I mean to say, it's only a fortune in jewels. Body found floating by the docks. He pushed his hand absently through the cold, hard, glittering stones, and they tickled pleasantly at the skin between his fingers. Pleasant, but perilous. We must still tread carefully, more carefully than ever. Chapter 14. Fear. It was a long way to the edge of the world, of that there could be no doubt. A long and a lonely and a nervous way. The sight of the corpses on the plain had worried everyone. The passing riders had made matters worse. The discomforts of the journey had in no way diminished. Giselle was still constantly hungry, usually too cold, often wet through, and would probably be saddle sore for the rest of his days. Every night he stretched out on the hard and lumpy ground, dozed and dreamed of home, only to wake to the pale morning more tired and aching than when he lay down. His skin crawled and chafed and stung with the unfamiliar feeling of dirt, and he was forced to admit that he had begun to smell almost as vile as the others. It was enough altogether to make a civilized man run mad. And now, to add to all of this, there was the constant nagging of danger. From that point of view, the terrain was not on Giselle's side. Hoping to shake off any pursuers, Baez had ordered them away from the river a few days earlier. The ancient road wound now through deep scars in the plain, through rocky gullies, through shadowy gorges, alongside chattering streams in deep valleys. Giselle began to think on the endless, grinding flatness almost with nostalgia. At least out there, one did not look at every rock and shrub and fold in the ground and wonder whether there was a crowd of bloodthirsty enemies behind it. He had chewed his fingernails almost until the blood ran. Every sound made him bite his tongue and spin around in his saddle, clutching at his steels, staring for a murderer who turned out to be a bird in a bush. It was not fear, of course, for Giselle Dan Luther, he told himself, would laugh in the face of danger. An ambush, or a battle, or a breathless pursuit across the plain, these things, he imagined, he could have taken in his stride. But this endless waiting, this mindless tension, this merciless rubbing by of slow minutes was almost more than he could stand. It might have helped had there been someone with whom he could share his unease. But as far as companionship went, little had changed. The cart still rolled along the cracked old road, while Quai sat grim and silent on top. Baez said nothing, but for the occasional lecture on the qualities of great leadership, qualities which seemed markedly absent in himself. Longfoot was off scouting out the route, only appearing every day or two to let them know how skillfully he was doing it. Pharaoh frowned at everything as though it were her personal enemy, and at Giselle most of all, it sometimes seemed, her hands never far from her weapons. She spoke rarely, and then only to Nine Fingers, to snarl about ambushes, or covering their tracks better, or the possibilities of being followed. The Northman himself was something of a puzzle. When Giselle had first laid eyes on him, gawping at the gate of the Agriont, he had seemed less than an animal. Out here in the wild, though, the rules were different. One could not simply walk away from a man one disliked, then do one's best to avoid him, belittle him in company, and insult him behind his back. Out here, you were stuck with the companions you had, and being stuck with him, Giselle had come slowly to realize that Nine Fingers was just a man after all. A stupid and a thuggish and a hideously ugly one, no doubt. As far as wit and culture went, He was a cut below the lowliest peasant in the fields of the Union. But Giselle had to admit that out of all the group, the Northman was the one he had come to hate least. He had not the pomposity of Bias, the watchfulness of Quai, the boastfulness of Longfoot, or the simple viciousness of Pharaoh. Giselle would not have been ashamed to ask a farmer his opinion on the raising of crops, or a smith his opinion on the making of armor, however dirty, ugly, or low-born they might have been. Why not consult a hardened killer on the subject of violence? "I understand that you have led men in battle," Giselle tried as his opening. The Northman turned his dark, slow eyes on him. "More than once." "And fought in duels?" "Aye." He scratched at the ragged scars on his stubbly cheek. "I didn't come to look like this from a wobbly hand at shaving." "If your hand was that wobbly, you would choose perhaps to grow a beard." Nine Fingers chuckled. Giselle was almost used to the sight now. It was still hideous, of course, but smacked more of good-natured ape than crazed murderer. "I might at that," he said. Giselle thought about it a moment. He did not wish to make himself appear weak, but honesty might earn the trust of a simple man. If it worked with dogs, why not with Northmen? "I myself," he ventured, "have never fought in a full-blooded battle." "You don't say." "No, truly. My friends are in Angland now, fighting against Bethod and his savages." Nine Fingers' eyes swiveled sideways. "I mean, that is to say, fighting against Bethod. I would be with them myself, had not Bias asked me to come on this venture." "Their loss is our gain." Giselle looked sharply across. From a subtler source, that might almost have sounded like sarcasm. "Bethod started this war, of course, a most dishonorable act of unprovoked aggression on his part. You'll get no argument from me on that score. Bethod's got a gift when it comes to starting wars. The only thing he's better at is the finishing of them." Giselle laughed. "You can't mean that you think he'll beat the Union?" "He's beaten worse odds. But you know best. We don't all have your experience." The laughter stuttered out in Giselle's throat. He was almost sure that had been irony, and it made him think for a moment. Was Nine Fingers looking at him now, and behind that scarred, that plodding, that battered mask, thinking, "What a fool"? Could it be that Bias had been right? That there was something to be learned from this Northman after all? There was only one way to find out. "What's a battle like?" he asked. "Battles are like men. No two are ever quite the same." "How do you mean?" "Imagine waking up at night to hear a crashing and a shouting, scrambling out of your tent into the snow with your trousers falling down, to see men all around you killing one another. Nothing but moonlight to see by. No clue who are enemies and who are friends. No weapon to fight with." "Confusing," said Giselle. "No doubt. Or imagine crawling in the mud between the stomping boots, trying to get away but not knowing where to go, with an arrow in your back and a sword cut across your ass, squealing like a pig and waiting for a spear to stick you through. A spear you won't even see coming." "Painful," agreed Giselle. "Very. Or imagine standing in a circle of shields no more than 10 strides across, all held by men roaring their loudest. There's just you and one other man in there, and that man's won a reputation for being the hardest bastard in the north, and only one of you can leave alive." Murmured Giselle. "That's right. You like the sound of any of those?" Giselle did not, and Nine Fingers smiled. "I didn't think so. And honestly, nor do I. I've been in all kind of battles and skirmishes and fights. Most of them started in chaos, and all of them ended in it. And not once did I not come near to shitting myself at some point." "You?" The Northman chuckled. "Fearlessness is a fool's boast, to my mind. The only men with no fear in them are the dead, or the soon-to-be dead, maybe. Fear teaches you caution and respect for your enemy, and to avoid sharp edges used in anger. All good things in their place, believe me. Fear can bring you out alive, and that's the very best anyone can hope for from any fight. Every man who's worth a damn feels fear. It's the use you make of it that counts. Be scared? That's your advice? My advice would be to find a good woman and steer well clear of the whole bloody business. And it's a shame no one told me the same 20 years ago. He looked sideways at Giselle. But if, say, you're stuck out on some great wide plain in the middle of nowhere and can't avoid it, there's 3 rules I'd take to a fight. First, always do your best to look the coward, the weakling, the fool. Silence is a warrior's best armor, the saying goes. Hard looks and hard words have never won a battle yet, but they've lost a few. Look the fool, eh? I see. Giselle had built his whole life around trying to appear the cleverest, the strongest, the most noble. It was an intriguing idea that a man might choose to look like less than he was. Second, never take an enemy lightly, however much the dullard he seems. Treat every man like he's twice as clever, twice as strong, twice as fast as you are, and you'll only be pleasantly surprised. Respect costs you nothing, and nothing gets a man killed quicker than confidence. Never underestimate the foe, a wise precaution. Giselle was beginning to realize that he had underestimated this Northman. He wasn't half the idiot he appeared to be. Third, watch your opponent as close as you can, and listen to opinions if you're given them. But once you've got your plan in mind, you fix on it and let nothing sway you. Time comes to act, you strike with no backward glances. Delay is the parent of disaster, my father used to tell me, and believe me, I've seen some disasters. No backward glances, muttered Giselle, nodding slowly to himself. Of course. Nine Fingers puffed out his pitted cheeks. There's no replacement for seeing it and doing it, but master all that, and you're halfway to beating anyone, I reckon. Halfway? What about the other half? The Northman shrugged. Luck. I don't like this, growled Pharaoh, frowning up at the steep sides of the gorge. Giselle wondered if there was anything in the world she did like. You think we're followed? Asked Baez. You see anyone? How could I see anyone from down here? That's the point. Good ground for an ambush, muttered Nine Fingers. Giselle looked around him nervously. Broken rocks, bushes, scrubby trees. The ground was full of hiding places. Well, this is the route that Longfoot picked for us, grumbled Baez, and there's no purpose in hiring a cleaner if you're going to swab the latrines yourself. Where the hell is that damn navigator anyway? Never around when you want him, only turns up to eat and boast for hours on end. If you knew how much that bastard cost me. Damn it. Nine Fingers pulled his horse up and clambered stiffly down from his saddle. A fallen tree trunk, wood cracked and grey, lay across the gorge, blocking the road. I don't like this. Pharaoh shrugged her bow from her shoulder. Neither do I, grumbled Nine Fingers, taking a step towards the fallen tree. But you have to be real. That's far enough! The voice echoed back and forth around the valley, brash and confident. Quai hauled on the reins and brought the cart to a sudden halt. Giselle looked along the lip of the gorge, his heart thumping in his mouth. He saw the speaker now. A big man dressed in antique leather armor, sitting carelessly on the edge of the drop with one leg dangling, his long hair flapping softly in the breeze. A pleasant and a friendly-looking man, as far as Giselle could tell at this distance, with a wide smile on his face. My name is Phineas, a humble servant of the Emperor Cabrian. Cabrian? Shouted Baez. I heard he'd lost his reason. He's got some interesting ideas, Phineas shrugged, but he's always seen us right. Let me explain matters. We're all around you. A serious-seeming man with a short sword and shield stepped out from behind the dead tree trunk. Two more appeared, and then three more, creeping out from behind the rocks, behind the bushes, all with serious faces and serious weapons. Giselle licked his lips. He would laugh in the face of danger, of course, but now it came to it, nothing seemed at all amusing. He looked over his shoulder. More men had come from behind the rocks they had passed a few moments before, blocking the valley in the other direction. Nine Fingers folded his arms. "Just once," he murmured. "I'd like to take someone else by surprise."
"There's a couple more of us," shouted Phineas. "Up here with me. Good hands with bows and ready with arrows."
Giselle saw their outlines now against the white sky, the curved shapes of their weapons.
"So you see that you'll be going no further down this road."
Baez spread his palms. "Perhaps we can come to some arrangement that suits us both. You need only name your price and—"
"Your money's no good to us, old man, and I'm deeply wounded by the assumption. We're soldiers, not thieves. We have orders to find a certain group of people. A group of people wandering out in the middle of nowhere, far from the traveled roads. An old bald bastard with a sickly-looking boy, some stuck-up Union fool, a scarred whore, and an ape of a northerner. You seen a crowd that might fit that description?" "If I'm the whore," shouted Nine Fingers, "who's the northerner?"
Giselle winced. "No jokes, please, no jokes." But Phineas only chuckled.
"They didn't tell me you were funny. Reckon that's a bonus. At least until we kill you. Where's the other one, eh? The navigator?"
"No idea," growled Baez. "Unfortunately, if anyone dies, it should be him."
"Don't take it too hard. We'll catch up with him later."
And Phineas laughed an easy laugh, and the men around them grinned and fingered their weapons.
"So, if you'd be good enough to give your arms to those fellows ahead of you, we can get you trussed up and start back towards Damium before nightfall."
"And when we get there?" Phineas gave a happy shrug.
"Not my business. I don't ask questions of the Emperor, and you don't ask questions of me. That way, no one gets skinned alive. Do you take my meaning, old man?"
"Your meaning is hard to miss, but I'm afraid that Damium is quite out of our way."
"What are you?" called Phineas. "Soft in the head?"
The nearest man stepped forward and grabbed hold of Baez's bridle.
"That's enough of that,"
he growled. Giselle felt that horrible sucking in his guts. The air around Baez's shoulders trembled like the hot air above a forge. The foremost of the men frowned, opened his mouth to speak. His face seemed to flatten, then his head broke open, and he was suddenly snatched away, as though flicked by a giant unseen finger. He had not even time to scream. Nor had the four men who stood behind him. Their ruined bodies, the broken remnants of the grey tree trunk, and a great quantity of earth and rocks around them were ripped from the ground and flung through the air to shatter against the rocky wall of the gorge 100 strides distant, with a sound like a house collapsing. Giselle's mouth hung open. His body froze. It had taken only a terrifying instant. One moment 5 men had been standing there, the next they were slaughtered meat among a heap of settling debris. Somewhere behind him he heard the hum of a bowstring. There was a cry, and a body dropped down into the valley, bounced from the sheer rocks, and flopped rag-like face down in the stream.
"Right, then!"
roared Baez, but Giselle could only sit in his saddle and gape. The air around the Magus was still moving, more than ever. The rocks behind him rippled and twisted like the stones on the bed of a stream. The old man frowned, stared down at his hands. "No," he muttered, turning them over before him. The brown leaves on the ground were lifting up into air, fluttering as though on a gust of wind. "No," said Baez, his eyes opening wide. His whole body had begun to shake. Giselle gawped as the loose stones around them rose from the ground, drifting impossibly upwards. Sticks began to snap from the bushes. Clods of grass began to tear themselves away from the rocks. His coat rustled and flapped, dragged upwards by some unseen force. "No!" screamed Baez, then his shoulders hunched in a sudden spasm. A tree beside them split apart with a deafening crack, and splinters of wood showered out into the whipping air. Someone was shouting, but Jezal could scarcely hear them. His horse reared, and he had not the wit to hold on. He crashed onto his back on the earth while the whole valley shimmered, trembled, vibrated around him. Bayaz's head snapped back, rigid, one hand up and clawing at the air. A rock the size of a man's head flew past Jezal's face and burst apart against a boulder. The air was filled with a storm of whipping rubbish, of fragments of wood and stone and soil and broken gear. Jezal's ears were ringing with a terrifying clattering, rattling, howling. He flung himself down on his face, crossed his arms over his head, and squeezed his eyes shut. He thought of his friends, of West and Jallenhorn and Casper, of Lieutenant Brint even. He thought of his family and his home, of his father and his brothers. He thought of Ardi. If he lived to see them again, he would be a better man. He swore it to himself with silent, trembling lips as the unnatural wind ripped the valley apart around him. He would no longer be selfish, no longer be vain, no longer be lazy. He would be a better friend, a better son, a better lover. If only he lived through this. If only he lived through this. If only... He could hear his own terrified breath coming in quick gasps, the blood surging in his head. The noise had stopped. Jezal opened his eyes. He lifted his hands from his head, and a shower of twigs and soil fell around him. The gorge was full of settling leaves, misty with choking dust. Nine Fingers was standing nearby, red blood running down his dirty face from a cut on his forehead. He was walking slowly sideways. He had his sword drawn, hanging down by his leg. Someone was facing him. One of the men that had blocked the way behind them, a tall man with a mop of red hair, circling each other. Jezal watched, kneeling, mouth wide open. He felt in some small way that he should intervene, but he had not the beginnings of an idea how to do so. The red-haired man moved suddenly, leaping forwards and swinging his sword over his head. He moved fast, but Nine Fingers was faster. He stepped sideways so that the whistling blade missed his face by inches, then he slashed his opponent across the belly as he passed. The man grunted, stumbled a step or two. Nine Fingers' heavy sword chopped into the back of his skull with a hollow clicking sound. He tripped over his own feet and pitched onto his face, blood bubbling from the gaping wound in his head. Jezal watched it spread slowly out through the dirt around the corpse. A wide, dark pool, slowly mingling with the dust and the loose soil on the valley floor. No second touch, no best of three. He became aware of a scuffling, grunting sound and looked up to see Nine Fingers staggering around with another man, a great big man. The two of them were growling and clawing at each other, wrestling over a knife. Jezal gawped at them. When had that happened? "Stab him!" shouted Nine Fingers as the two of them grappled. "Fucking stab him!" Jezal knelt there, staring up. One hand gripped the hilt of his long steel as though he were hanging off a cliff and this was the last handful of grass. The other hung limp. There was a gentle thud. The big man grunted. There was an arrow sticking out of his side. Another thud. 2 arrows. A third appeared, tightly grouped. He slid slowly out of Nine Fingers' grip onto his knees, coughing and moaning. He crawled towards Jezal, sat back slowly, grimacing and making a strange mewling sound. He lay back in the road, the arrows sticking up into the air like rushes in the shallows of a lake. He was still. What about that Phineas bastard? He got away. He'll get others. It was deal with him or deal with that one there. I had that one. Course you did. If you could have held him another year, maybe Luther might have got round to drawing a blade, eh? Strange voices. Nothing to do with him. Jezal wobbled slowly up to his feet. His mouth was dry, his knees were weak, his ears were ringing. Bayaz lay in the road on his back a few strides away, his apprentice kneeling beside him. One of the wizard's eyes was closed, the other slightly open, the lid twitching, a slit of white eyeball showing underneath. "You can let go of that now." Giselle looked down. His hand was still clenched around the grip of his steel, knuckles white. He willed his fingers to relax, and they slowly uncurled far away. His palm ached from all that gripping. Giselle felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" Nine Fingers' voice. "Eh? You hurt?" Giselle stared at himself, turning his hands over stupidly. Dirty, but no blood. "I don't think so." "Good. The horses ran. Who could blame them, right? If I had 4 legs, I'd be halfway back to the sea by now." "What?" "Why don't you catch them?" "Who made you the leader?" Nine Fingers' heavy brows drew in slightly. Giselle became aware that they were standing very close to one another and that the Northman's hand was still on his shoulder. It was only resting there, but he could feel the strength of it through his coat, and it felt strong enough to twist his arm off. Damn his mouth, it got him in all kinds of trouble. He expected a punch in the face at the very least, if not a fatal wound in his head. But Nine Fingers only pursed his lips thoughtfully and began to speak. "We're a lot different, you and me. Different in all kinds of ways. I see you don't have much respect for my kind, or for me in particular, and I don't much blame you. The dead know I got my shortcomings, and I ain't entirely ignorant of them. You may think you're a clever man, and I'm a stupid one, and I dare say you're right. There's sure to be a very many things that you know more about than I do. But when it comes to fighting, I'm sorry to say, there's few men with a wider experience than me. No offense, but we both know you're not one of them. No one made me the leader, but this is the task that needs doing." He stepped closer still, his great paw gripping Giselle's shoulder with a fatherly firmness halfway between reassurance and threat. "Is that a worry?" Giselle thought about it for a moment. He was out of his depth, and the events of the past few minutes had demonstrated beyond question just how far. He looked down at the man that Nine Fingers had killed only a moment before, and the cleft in the back of his head yawned wide. Perhaps, for the moment, it would be best if he simply did as he was told. "No worry," he said. "Good." Nine Fingers grinned, clapped him on the shoulder, and let him go. "Horses still need catching, and you're the man for the job, I reckon." Giselle nodded and stumbled away to look for them.